So special angles. So anytime you recognize one of the families that we have, you can say what family that belongs to. You can figure out what quadrant it's in. And once you figure out what family and what quadrant it's in, then you can state what the value is. So for sine of 7 pi over 6, what family does that belong to? That belongs to the 30 degrees family. So our reference angle would be our pi over 6 family. What quadrant is it in? It's in quadrant 3. So what I like to do for these is I would say I've memorized my first quadrant. And I know that sine of pi over 6 is a half. So that means sine of 7 pi over 6 is going to equal negative 1/2. Because in quadrant 3, sine is negative, and it's still going to equal a half. So tan of 2 pi over 3, when I'm figuring that out, what family is that? The pi over 3 family. What quadrant is it in? Quadrant 2. Is tan positive or negative in quadrant 2? Negative. In preparation for your quiz, have you come up with any studies, techniques, or any things yet that help you memorize it? Not yet. For tan, I'll tell you one of the ones I like to use for tan. For tan of pi over 4, somehow that one's easy to remember that it's 1. But to decide which one is pi over 3 and which one is pi over 6, I remember they both have a square root of 3 in them. But for pi over 6, 3 plus 3 is 6. So that's how I remember that. That one goes there. And 3 matches with that 3 there. I don't know if that's a way to help you remember them as a shortcut for memorizing. You could obviously draw all your special triangles and get them that way too. But if you wanted some quick ways, so now when I see tan of pi over 6, I can think root 3 over 3 quickly because I've got that little memorization technique that helps me. Cos of 7 pi over 4. The nice thing about radians is it's really easy to figure out your reference angle. What family does this belong to? Pi over 4. What quadrant is it in? Quadrant 4. So first of all, it's going to be positive because cos is positive in quadrant 4. And cos of your pi over 4 family is always root 2 over 2. For secant of negative pi over 4, you're first going to think about the reciprocal. So we're going to figure out what cos of negative pi over 4 is. Notice again, we don't flip the angle. We're going to flip the ratio, but not the angle for a reciprocal function. Family, pi over 4 family. What quadrant? Negative pi over 4? Quadrant 4. So if you're part of the pi over 4 family, cos will be positive in quadrant 4, and cos of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. That means secant of pi over 4 will be 2 over root 2. Do you remember when we did our special triangle and we initially wrote this as 1 over root 2 and then we rationalized the denominator? So what you'll notice often with pi over 4 with secant and cosecant, when they're written in multiple choice, if I do the reciprocal of 1 over root 2, I just get root 2. So be aware that root 2 over 2 and 1 over root 2 are the same, and 2 over root 2 and root 2, those would be the same. Cotangent. So again, we're going to be thinking about tangent of negative 11 pi over 6. Don't flip the angle. We're looking at our pi over 6 family. And what quadrant would a negative 11 pi over 6 be? Quadrant 1. So tan of my pi over 6 is root 3 over 3 and would be positive in quadrant 1. So cotangent of negative 11 pi over 6 will be 3 over root 3. And since this is equal to 1 over root 3, that's the same as root 3. Yeah. No, if you were asked to give an answer, you could write it as 3 over root 3 and leave your answer like that. Or if you wanted to simplify to root 3, you could. Where it is important that you know how to do that is for multiple choice questions, because multiple choice question would probably have root 3 as the answer, and you would probably get 3 over root 3 as your starting point, and then you'd have to know how to rationalize the denominator to solve it. But when you're asked to provide an answer, you can give it in any correct form. You don't have to rationalize the denominator. You don't have to simplify fractions. So if you wanted to, you could write it as 3,000 over 1,000 root 3. Which means the same thing, just with extra numbers. And our last one here, cosecant of negative pi over 2. So we're going to think about sine of negative pi over 2. Can you see that this is part of your axes family? Which means that your reference angle is pi over 2, and it's not in a quadrant. It's between, in this case, negative pi over 2 would be between quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So if we're looking for, and I find whenever we're dealing with the axes family, I think it's most helpful just to think about the unit circle. Down here at this point, what are your coordinates? 0 and negative 1. So what is sine of negative pi over 2? The y coordinate would just be negative 1. If you do the reciprocal, I mean, I could write it like this, but that's the same as negative 1 for cosecant then as well. So the exam sometimes will ask these straightforward short questions like this, multiple choice, just 1 mark, but more typically you will see questions that look like this, and they're often 3 marks on your final exam, which is just grouping 3 things together plus the coterminal angles that we did earlier in the day, all into one question. So as far as work goes, we are going to get a number to put in here, times by a number to put in here, times by a number to put in there. For secant 11 pi over 3, I'll just split my page up here and show my work off to the side. So to figure out what number I'm going to put into there, I'm going to think about cos of 11 pi over 3. We know that that's part of the pi over 3 family. What quadrant is that in? And how do we figure out what quadrant that's in? Well, this is what we were doing earlier in the day. 11 over 3 is the same as 3 2/3 pi. And so it's going to be in the 4th quadrant. Is cos positive or negative in the 4th quadrant? Positive. And the cos of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. No, cos of pi over 3 is 1/2. Sorry. So cos of 11 pi over 3, since it's in quadrant 4 where it's positive, and we know our pi over 3 cos value is a half, inside for secant 11 pi over 3, we will write the reciprocal 2 over 1. Cos of negative 5 pi over 4, what quadrant is that in? Quadrant 2, because you're going in the negative direction. And so cos is negative in quadrant 2. We know that pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, and this one will be negative because it's in quadrant 2. And tan of 23 pi over 6. Well, 23 pi over 6 is 3 and 5/6 pi. So what quadrant will that be in? Quadrant 4. Because 3 pi would be 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi would end here, and then you need to go over half, 5/6 of the way. So it would end in quadrant 4. Is tan positive or negative in quadrant 4? Negative. Pi over 6 family for tan is root 3 over 3. So again, if you know your quadrant 1, that'll tell you the value. And then your quadrant will tell you whether it's positive or negative. When we multiply this all through, well, I can simplify 2 divided by 2 will simplify out to be 1s. Negative times negative, this will be positive. Root 2 times root 3 will be root 6 over 3. This is usually a 3-mark question. If you forgot your negatives inside here, you would get the same answer, but you would lose a half a mark for each thing, your work, each value inside of those brackets needs to be exactly that. So we get root 6 over 3.